This year, the Jewish holiday of Passover happens at the same time as the Christian holiday of Easter. And I grew up in a family where my father was Jewish and my mother was Catholic, so this time of year was sometimes a bit schizophrenic in my household because depending on where we spent spring break, I was either one of the chosen of God who could not eat ham or have dairy with meat. Instead, we ate pickled gefilte fish and dry matzah. On alternative years, I was a sinner before God, but I got to eat my fill of roast ham and buttery rolls. I always wanted to combine the Jewish sense of being beloved and blessed of God and still have the Christian holiday meals. And actually, since I was raised Unitarian Universalist by my parents, I was able to bring those two together growing up. But even though we sometimes visited my mother's family and celebrated Easter, or visited my father's family, in which case we would celebrate Passover, I never really understood the connection. To a child, they seem like completely different holidays. In one, you have to dip bitter herbs in salt water and eat them while talking about being slaves in Egypt. In the other, you get to eat jelly beans and chocolate eggs all day until you get sick. For a child, these traditions seemingly have nothing in common. It was only much later in my life that I made the connection between the Jewish story of Passover and Easter. So in Passover, to avoid the 10th plague and to gain freedom from slavery, Jewish families were told to sacrifice their best lamb and place a mark with its blood on the doorway of their home so that God would know to pass over their house during this final plague. They would then be free to go to the promised land here on earth. In Christianity, the idea is that Jesus is the sacrificial paschal lamb who is sacrificed so that through the sign and the symbol of his blood, those who believe will be freed from their bondage in sin and will be passed over from the consequences of their sinful nature and will be welcomed into the promised land in heaven. Are you with me so far? Pretty much? All right. So both stories involve bondage and sacrifice, blood and freedom, which culminates in some future promised land. Now, I always wondered why, when Moses explained to the Jews that after the final plague, they would be free from their suffering and their bondage, but the people didn't want to go. They said, "What will we eat if we run into the desert? How will we survive? How do we know that our lives will be better somewhere else? How do we know that we won't die if we leave Egypt?" Now, I could never figure out why, when given the choice between the suffering and the indignities of slavery and being free, that the people would not want to go. Author Rachel Naomi Remen, whose grandfather was a rabbi, tells us that he explained to her it was not so much a choice between slavery and freedom, it was a choice between slavery and the unknown. He explained how people will stay in all kinds of places and patterns and predicaments and even endure great suffering in order to avoid change and uncertainty. Can you imagine having to flee your home, the home you've known for generations and all your life, taking only the belongings that you can carry in bundles on your back? Just imagine those long lines of ragged people heading into the darkness and into the desert with their dogs and their cats and their crying children in tow. As I grew up, I came to realize that these stories are not just about things that apparently happened thousands of years ago to other people, but these are stories about us now. As Dr. Remen says of Passover, It's a story about how today we can get enslaved in our ideas of worthlessness or lack of self-esteem, or by our insatiable desires and greed. We can be trapped by our sense of victimhood or entitlement. We can be enslaved by our own fear of change and therefore cling to behaviors that are too small and even damaging to us and to others, because letting go will cause us to have to face the unknown. Now, this isn't some abstract idea, some abstract theology that I'm talking about. This is real. I received a call just the other day. On Thursday, I heard from a former member of the church who's since moved away to another state, but who wanted me to know that their adult daughter and sister died of alcoholism on Thursday night. She was found in the morning next to an empty bottle of vodka. She'd been suffering in the bondage of addiction for almost 10 years. Her now teenage children eventually distanced themselves from their mother because it had become too painful to stay in relationship and watch her continually turning back to the hell of her addiction and dragging them all back in with her. Now, I don't know her specific story, but writer Anne Lamott describes her own experience of alcoholism in this way. When the life force was going downward like an elevator heading for the basement, it was about resisting life, staying numb, shutting out the vague, lifelong shame with old patterns that seemed to save me from hurting even worse. One thing that she knew for certain was that the alcohol could shut off her feelings, at least temporarily. She had no idea what might happen if she could muster the strength to face the pain and the shame and the other drivers of her addictions. Years ago, when a friend of mine was dating someone who was a heroin addict, one day she finally said to him, "You need to choose between me or your addiction. You can't have both." And he looked her in the eyes and he said, despite the incredible love that is between them, he said he would choose his addiction because he said he could always count on heroin to be there for him, but he could not be sure that he could count on her. Now, whether it's a chemical addiction or some other behavior that we do that enslaves us, there's a tendency to be willing to stay stuck in things that do not allow us to become fully alive and fully free. People are enslaved to money, power, bad relationships, youthfulness, glamour, image, reputation, old family stories, and other things that become our master. Things that limit our circumference and our ability to love and to be loved. People even become enslaved to their grief. A person can feel that he cannot let go of the pain of the loss of somebody who has died, because to move on, he's afraid would cause him to forget the one who has died. The pain becomes their connection to the past, their connection to the person who is gone. Sometimes when we do this, we make a monument of our pain to remember people who we've lost, even though their lives were a testament to love. The pain is familiar, and we're not sure what will happen if we let go. Now, the reason that Easter and Passover, these stories are so popular and they're so enduring, is because at times we all have things that hold us back from living fully. And because freedom is as frightening to us today as it was to the Israelites all those years ago. But to live fully involves being willing to sacrifice what's familiar for what is most true. And the promised land that exists on the other side of these sacrifices is different for each one of us. But the promise itself is the same. It is about the fullness and the goodness that is inside of us. It's about allowing ourselves to know that we belong to one another and that we belong to life itself. and knowing that on this day we gather to sing and to celebrate that death never has the last word. We are reminded each year at this time that after death comes new life. When we gather, we sing, Jesus Christ has risen today. Let us remember that Jesus and the disciples and the Israelites, they rose to their challenges. The question before you and me is, will we rise to ours? What are you in bondage to? And are you ready to be risen from your own living tombs? Are you ready to rise up into the resurrection of your own spirit and your own life? Because today is the day that you've been given, and this is the life that you have. And none of us know how much time we have left, and a life is a terrible thing to waste. Rise up. Because you've probably sinned. I know I have. Yet you've also been chosen to be blessed and to be a blessing. Both stories we celebrate this week are very clear that when we take the risk and make the sacrifices that it takes to live fully, God and the Spirit of love and the essence of life will be with us and will not let us go. Rise up. You are a child of God. You are a child of this beautiful, miraculous world of ours. You are loved. Happy Easter. I love you. Amen.